So one of my favorite things about survival horror games are the puzzles. In fact, that's a big reason why I enjoy the Resident Evil games so much. The franchise has always been known to deliver some really creative and difficult puzzles to give us a brief moment away from the gore and horrors that await us around each corner of the games. However, like with many other survival horror games featuring puzzles, sometimes we might find ourselves getting stumped because of the difficulty of said puzzles. Well, in this episode of Nerd Games, I'm taking a look at every entry of the RE franchise as I locate the 10 most difficult puzzles of the series. Whether it's a game of memory, a logic puzzle, or a slightly more difficult riddle, these brain teasers are the ones that took us the longest to solve in a Resident Evil game. So, my name is Ruben with Nerd Games, and this is the top 10 hardest puzzles of Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, Church Puzzle, Resident Evil 4. The downside of the action trilogy, aka RE4 to RE6, is the lack of puzzles in these games. With that being said, there are a few puzzles in RE4, and actually there's one that's difficult enough to crack the top 10 hardest puzzles of the franchise. In the church where Ashley is being kept, there's a puzzle that needs to be solved in order to rescue Ashley. The idea is to move the different colors around to create the solution, however that's easier said than done. It can be quite a pain to correctly position the colors to create the hidden symbol. It's nowhere near as difficult as the rest of the puzzles on today's list, especially the higher ones, but it's difficult enough to claim the number 10 spot on today's list. Number 9, The Drug Lab, Resident Evil 2 Remake. I went back and forth about which puzzle did I think was harder, the Drug Lab puzzle in RE2 Remake or the vaccine synthesizer in RE3 Remake. Ultimately, I went with the Drug Lab puzzle, especially on hardcore and during the second scenario. Maybe it's because I'm not good at mentally picturing exactly what I need to do with mixing the different vials to get the correct amount needed for the herbicide, but holy shit, I took forever doing this the first time. And it's not something that got easier with me in future playthroughs. In fact, I just streamed this game like 3 weeks ago, and you can ask anybody in the chat at that time, I definitely took my sweet ass time trying to solve this puzzle. I just couldn't picture what I needed to do next, and it turned into a guessing game, and I just kept mixing shit together until I managed to get the correct amount distributed between the vials. Number 8, Nights, Resident Evil 2002 Remake. Speaking of puzzles that are hard for me in multiple playthroughs, figuring out the night puzzle in the 2002 remake of the first game is something that to this day I still forget how to solve. Now listen, I know the puzzle doesn't really change at all on your future playthroughs, but I'm not like most of you guys, I don't write shit down. And even if I did, I'm trying to look at this puzzle from the perspective of someone that is solving it for the first time without any guidance, and man does it piss me off to no end every single time that a night pops out as I push one in. Number 7, Food Chain Puzzle, Resident Evil 0. The food chain puzzle in RE0 is one of my favorite puzzles of the franchise. Perhaps it's because it's a riddle that requires logic to solve. Essentially, the puzzle requires you to read each of the plaques below the 6 animal statues gathered in a circle. Each plaque gives a hint as to where this statue falls in terms of the food chain. The goal here is to recreate the correct food chain order by lighting the statues in order. The hints will give you an idea of what animal it's above and what animal it's below. Follow the clues and you'll be able to identify the correct order that the 6 statues will need to be lit. As long as you can understand what each clue is hinting towards, this puzzle shouldn't take too long to figure out. But for those of you that have trouble with logic puzzles, the food chain puzzle could prove to be more challenging than other puzzles of the franchise. Number 6, From Cradle to Grave, Resident Evil 1996. Another favorite puzzle of mine was actually one of the first puzzles that we came across in the series. In the gallery room of the Spencer Mansion, you'll notice 2 things. There are crows lurking at the top of the room, and there are portraits lined up along the walls of the room. Both of these things connect to a puzzle within this room. At the end of the hallway inside of this room, there's a riddle. Essentially, the riddle tells the player to push the buttons under each portrait in order of the life cycle. So basically, you're following the life cycle from cradle to grave. To solve, you'll need to start with the portrait with the youngest character and then end with the one where the character in the portrait is at their oldest. If done right, the portrait at the end of the hallway will reveal a key item needed to access the exterior of the mansion. If done wrong, well, those birdies at the top of the room that I mentioned at the start of today's video will gladly be paying you a visit. Number 5, Chest Plugs, Resident Evil 2 Remake. So I love riddles, and believe it or not, the original Resident Evil 2 lacked riddles for the player to solve. However, the remake actually added a brand new puzzle unique to the remake, and it's easily one of the most difficult puzzles of the franchise. In the sewers of Raccoon City, the player will find 6 plugs that all give them access to either an injured Ada Wong or Sherry Birkin depending on the playable character. In order to open this door, the player will need to solve a riddle. Now to be fair, this puzzle is different based on the difficulty that you are playing on as well as which playthrough you are doing. For this entry, I'm looking at the puzzle on hard difficulty. Anyway, it's another logic puzzle that requires you to read out the clues under certain plugins and by a process of elimination, identify which plug needs to go and which plugin. Before that though, you actually need to recover each of the 3 missing plugs, which 2 of those actually required you to solve another additional puzzle regarding a maze of some sort. Only once you have all 3 of these additional plugs can you solve this logic puzzle. Between the maze that needs to be solved to retrieve the king and queen plugs and the riddle that tells you where each piece goes, the chess pieces of Resident Evil 2 Remake is easily one of the more difficult puzzles of the franchise. Number 4, Synthesizer, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And we are back with RE3 Nemesis, only this time we take a look at the synthesizer in the hospital. This is a logic puzzle that you must solve as Carlos, and it requires the process of elimination as you will need to figure out what valve does what in order to correctly create the exact valve position in order to create the antidote. Wow, that's a mouthful. I'll be completely honest with you guys, this puzzle was a much bigger issue than I expected it to be. Even when I did solve it, I literally just kept doing every possible combination until I finally solved it. Still, because of the lack of possible combinations compared to one other puzzle on this list, the synthesizer didn't take too long to solve. But the fact that I had to rely completely on random guessing until I solved it is a big reason why it's number 4 on today's list. Let me know in the comments if you guys had as much trouble as I did on this puzzle. Number 3, Portrait Room, Resident Evil, Code Veronica. With the challenging boss fights, iconic characters, and unique settings, Code Veronica has a lot to appreciate. As for the puzzles, there's actually a couple of them. However, my favorite and most difficult puzzle in this game is the Portrait Room puzzle. Here, the player will find portraits of each and every head of the Ashford family. Each portrait, like the Cradle To Grave puzzle in the original game, has a button underneath it. Also in this room is a memo from the butler that discusses the previous Ashford family leaders. The goal of this puzzle is to identify which portrait connects to which Ashford family leader. From here, you have to push the buttons in order of when each Ashford family member became the leader of the family. Doing so will expose Alexia's portrait along with a vase. The clues are extremely small, so solving this puzzle requires you to pay close attention to each and every word within this memo in order to solve the puzzle correctly. Number 2, Water Sample Puzzle, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Most people that you ask will tell you that this is the hardest puzzle of the entire franchise, but personally, I would have to disagree with that statement. Although that doesn't mean that this puzzle isn't difficult. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. The water sample puzzle to me is the second most difficult puzzle of the franchise. As the last major puzzle of the game, the water sample puzzle tests your logic skills to the max as it requires you to put the 3 sections in a specific position in order to match the main section. However, what's annoying is that A, B, and C don't necessarily fit in that order. Meaning instead of picturing the rows in the order given, you need to picture them as blocks that pile on top of each other the more there are in a specific column. Does that kind of make sense to you at all? I know it's a bit confusing to explain, but stay with me. Doing this, it's much easier to align these sections correctly. However, the whole out of the order rows situation could take a while to figure out, and it's quite possible that you'll spend a ton of time trying to force them into the right position by assuming they need to be in that order, which in turn could make this puzzle way more difficult than it needs to be. Because of that, this puzzle claims the number 2 spot for most difficult puzzle of the franchise. And yes, while it's a pain if you don't know what the trick is, it's at least possible to logically figure out the puzzle, which is more than I can say for the next entry on today's list. Number 1, Clock Puzzle, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. A majority of the puzzles in Resident Evil feature puzzles that require logic, and in most cases the solution on how to solve the puzzle isn't that difficult to figure out, especially once you know the trick. However, the clock puzzle in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is one of the hardest puzzles in survival horror games, and to this day I still don't understand the logic of solving this puzzle. As I've said multiple times now, RE3 Nemesis features some of the most difficult puzzles of the franchise. Yet each of these puzzles are solvable with logic, albeit some take a little more time to figure out than others. Still, the only way I can ever solve the clock puzzle in the clock tower is literally by a process of elimination. Seriously, that's it. Just keep trying every single combination possible until something just clicks. Thankfully, there's about 6 combinations, which means a process of elimination to solve can save you plenty of time so long as you keep track of which combinations you've used so far. Still, it's ridiculous that the puzzle relies heavily on the process of elimination when a majority of the puzzles of the franchise relies on logic to solve. But that's it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is the clock puzzle in the clock tower the hardest puzzle of Resident Evil, or is there a different puzzle that you think deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.